Sanjay Rao, and this is our presentation from Snap Clarity and CMAP Health. Welcome to the participants. I'm glad that even in the short notice, many of you have registered and shown interest, and I hope this will be a worthwhile and useful presentation for you. So I'm going to just switch on my slides to get the presentation going. So I'd like to thank Snap Clarity, who's providing us with excellent IT support as we are streaming this presentation, and my colleague Bonnie Kuehl, who's watching all your comments in the background, and hopefully you'll be able to get some answers for your comments. I'm just going to quickly check the presentation is on. Okay. So Surviving the Crisis is our presentation for the current ongoing situation that we have globally. It probably doesn't require any further description, so without much further ado, I'll launch into the presentation. The two of us are presenters, and Bonnie Kuehl is looking into your questions and comments in the background. I suggest that we take the questions at the end. You can keep sending your questions, but we'll answer them in the end to keep the flow of the presentation. I'd also like to say that there are a lot of things being covered in this presentation. And if you feel there's too much information to handle all of at the same time, you can always go back and view our videos, which will be posted in our various sites at Snap Clarity and CMAP Health. So what we want to share this evening are not just a few tips and tricks. What we really want to share with you is a conceptualization of how to deal with the situation, because as much as coronavirus is a physical health crisis, it's also a mental health crisis. And we have already started seeing people struggling with their mental health, and we're seeing presentations in the emergency room, across our outpatient departments, and also in the community. And if people are watching this from other parts of the world outside of Canada, North America, this will not be a dissimilar scenario for you. This is one of the times where we are actually fairly united in our experiences of this crisis, mentally and physically. So there is a crisis, absolutely. And what's really paradoxical is that this is the first time which people will remember in decades that we are actually interconnected as the entire world in this crisis. So this is our brief classification of this crisis from health perspective. So there's a large amount of general stress affecting well-being of people all across the world. And then there are those people who are suffering from mental health conditions, and there may be exacerbation of their situation just now. And then those people who have actually made good recovery from their mental health conditions, but are at a risk of relapse. And as we actually work with our mental health system, we are trying to monitor how best we can serve these three different groups of people. Interestingly, across the world, it does not matter which country you live in and how developed the country's health services are. Generally, mental health services have been underfunded. But the positive part of all this is there's a paradoxical increase in access to services in general, health services in general, and mental health services in particular. There have been many occasions in the past a few days to few weeks where I've directly streamed into many of our clients' homes and provided consultations. In fact, last weekend when I was on call, I could help one of the clients to actually have the consultation from home rather than come to the emergency room for her mental health problem. So being informed is really important. Across the world, the governments are trying to flatten the curve of the viral load which is going across the community. And we are all together in this. And anything that we are doing today, tomorrow, is to flatten this curve so that we can prevent the people who are more frail and more susceptible to infections from getting unwell. So our job is to cooperate and survive. And this is the definition of resilience, which is not just individual, but across the world and global. So there is a lot of advice out there, and many of the things we are going to say has already been covered in various forums. I have no doubts about it. What we want to do is give you some useful pieces of information which you can apply even as things keep changing, because data keeps changing, facts keep changing, the spread of virus keeps changing. And in those changing circumstances, as the governments change what they're doing about this, we want to have some sort of template to survive these changes. So we actually reviewed lots of papers, and this was part of other studies that we've been doing. And we found that the single most important predictor of success in life, or a predictor of our ability to manage things, is actually our belief, faith, and confidence in the fact that we can take action. So it's actually not even the ability, but the belief in one's ability. Scientists call this self-efficacy. Well, let's learn from our recent history. So this is Dr. Viktor Frankl. Dr. Frankl was a psychiatrist, and he was in one of the Nazi concentration camps, actually maybe in perhaps more than one of the concentration camps. Dr. Frankl managed to survive the camps. Many perished, and Dr. Frankl took upon himself to tell us how we can survive this adversity. And in my mind, that is probably the best example of resilience. So what was his secret? His secret was very simple. In managing his suffering and adversity, he had to find a personal meaning in it. And that has been the most important message of surviving adversity to us from our history. He coined the term logotherapy and devised a style of therapy whilst he was in the concentration camps, based on the fact that we can survive all suffering if we can give a personal meaning to this. And he uses the term will to meaning, which actually indicates that even when something as meaningless as being persecuted in the way people were being in the concentration camps, there is a possibility of finding meaning in that suffering, and one has to find meaning in that suffering. So before the how, what Dr. Frankl really emphasizes is why. So why should we survive this suffering? That's really important from his perspective. So he defines 3 ways of finding purpose: doing something, which is an action or a deed which one finds meaningful. So for instance, you might find meaning in the simple act of perhaps writing a journal, exercising, meeting people. Many of these things may be simple acts, but may be deeply meaningful to you. Focusing on the experience of the person. So Dr. Frankl realized that some of the things that we do, even something simple as listening to music, some experience that you can have during the day might itself be very meaningful. He had a strong emphasis on focusing on person. So meaning should not just be a private affair, but must involve people around us as well. And eventually, even in the most indescribable suffering, he felt that meaning could be found. So we don't have a lot of time, but this is a good place where you should make note and think, in the current situation that we are finding ourselves, is there something which strikes you, however small or big, as meaningful to you personally and to people around you as well? So without the why, nothing would make sense. So we are getting a lot of advice about sleep, diet, routines, connecting with people. But what is the why behind that? And we have to take the opportunity to answer that question for ourselves, to then make sense of all the tips and techniques and good advice that is coming across to us. So let's rethink the idea of stress, which has a very negative connotation in today's society. Uh, we could probably do another talk on this, but stress is not all bad. Stress also helps us find solutions to the problems that we are facing. It can motivate us. So finding meaning in stress is really important. So we have a number of challenges before us, and all of this has come quite suddenly to people all across the world. So what is it that's important in these challenges for us? And as I mentioned earlier, this is a personal question, but also a societal and perhaps even a political question. So having asked the question why, and why is the meaning behind it all, the next question is who. So who is the person asking this question? And here's how we define it. The person in this situation is a person who brings in their own unique strengths and resources. So it would be important to ask yourself, what is driving you right now? And what are the resources around you? Because you're not alone in this, there are people around you. This is another really important quote from Dr. Frankl. Everything can be taken away from a man, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances and to choose one's own way. It's interesting when I recall the time I read this book, and if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Frankl was in the concentration camp, and I think he was stripped bare. He was trying to write a book. His manuscripts were taken away. And I think he frames this question around that time, that even when you're possessing of nothing, attitude makes a big difference. And he actually wrote on scraps of paper here and there to write his magnum opus, Man's Search for Meaning. So there are two components to this survival attitude. We've already talked about the meaning, but also the belief in oneself to take action. So we started with why, we started with who, you and the people around you, and now we're entering into the much more refined definition of what. So very often in defining problems, we have a very big abstract definition of the problem, like finances, children, health, and overall, in terms of successful problem solving, it's good to be specific. And here are some examples that I've outlined how to be specific. But even though we might be faced with the same problem, it may not affect us in the same way. Often people say we are on the same boat, but in fact, we are on the same ocean, but we might be driving our own different boats. So moving from problem to solutions. One way we've approached this when we've been coaching people in our research projects is to help them identify the top 3, 4, 5 problems. Because often in a state of worry, people identify too many problems and feel very fatigued when they're trying to address them. Identifying the top 2 to 3 would help you become focused and work on them more effectively. So maintaining our momentum of this discussion from why to how to what, we're not going to look at how to break problems down and choose solutions. There are really 2 major ways of breaking things down. If the problem is very big, break it down. If you're worried about your finances, break it down to the budget for the week or for the month. If you are working on the same problem as finances, look at multiple solutions. Should you be speaking to your bank? Are there people who can help you? Do you have savings which you can rely on? So these are examples of breaking the problem down or listing multiple solutions. So what next? Well, the next is to choose one of the solutions, or at least one part of the problem, and apply the solution. Now, well, I'm aware of the safe distance guidelines, so Even though people are holding hands, we are just using that as a metaphor here. Now, if problem solving puts us on the track towards goals, we also need to examine what's under the hood. So sometimes if the car is spluttering, we need to look at the engine. And this is where cognitive behavioral therapy is very helpful. It tells us what's going on under the hood, literally what's going on inside our minds when we are faced with difficulties. But as you can imagine, unlike a car, you can't change parts. There are no spare parts to be fitted. So we have to use our mind to work with the problems of the mind. This is a very simple illustration of cognitive behavioral therapy, and this is actually not a lecture on cognitive behavioral therapy, so we'll just have a very brief overview. Our thoughts, emotions, behaviors, body sensations are interlinked as a whole experience. A cognitive behavioral therapist helps you break these down so that you can address these things individually. But in general, addressing any one of these changes the whole cycle of experiences that we are having. So going into more specific now, so I've given you a general framework of problem solving. Let's go into specific details. So right now in the situation that we are finding ourselves, we are likely to face two big areas of emotions. One is anxiety, and the second is low mood or depression. Now, these may be at a level of a diagnosable problem which requires treatment, or these may just be emotions which come and go. Either way, these are the signatures of these emotions. When people are anxious, they tend to try and reduce the anxiety, avoid, worry, etc. When people are suffering from low mood, the general tendency is to despair, withdraw. And none of these things are completely abnormal. But the issue is, if it becomes very excessive, they can prevent us from taking effective action. So recognizing the emotion and its impact is really important. And to do that, we have to reference back to the issue of meaning. What is most meaningful to us in these situations? And how are our emotions impacting us from acting on those things which are meaningful to us? Sometimes it's very hard for us to look outside of ourselves. So it would be useful to have someone who could coach you. Now, this could be a professional therapist, but this could equally be a wise friend or a family member. So these could be resources around you, or you could be a resource for someone else in helping them work through things. We'll just shift to some general problems, which I think are a common experience across the world just now. This may not be the most comprehensive list, but this certainly covers a good range of problems. Talking about worrying and uncertainty, when I was kind of looking at this visual, which is about brain evolution, interestingly, as I was trying to highlight how human brain has evolved, the arrow pointed out to the brain and then pointed to the mouth as well. So what that means is animals, generally, except humans, don't think as much or have very primitive forms of thinking. So worrying is really a product of the brain being highly developed. It helps us solve problems. It helps us anticipate the future. But when worry gets fueled by excessive uncertainty, it actually takes over our lives and prevents us from effective problem solving. And we are hoping to have another presentation on this next week, which will go into much more details. So we can work very effectively with worrying. I think I'm going to just connect my battery, so I apologize for the interruption. Okay, back on. So very often we start thinking of worrying as thoughts. But in fact, worrying is a form of activity. And if we think of worrying as an activity, we have a choice of another activity which is more effective. So for instance, if you're spending a lot of time worrying, there might be a way to engage with other things which are important in life, perhaps calling a friend, doing something which you might enjoy. This could be music, exercise. So you can choose to shift from one activity to another. Initially, when we talked about distancing, we were thinking about social distancing, but in fact, it's not really social distancing. It's about the physical distance to stop the virus from spreading. So distancing is not a social issue. Distancing is more of a physical issue. So there are many reasons why social connections are important. It is really important for our social rhythm. So when people are depressed and they tend to withdraw from people, it affects the 24-hour social rhythm that we have. There's also science behind social connections, our health, even the style and fashion that we follow can be influenced by our social connections. So even our second and third degree connections can be very influential. I'm just trying to make sure that the slide is getting shared. So one of the ways that we work on this issue is to help people take a stock of their interpersonal resources. This is commonly used across evidence-based psychological treatments. So this is the person, and they have a range of people in their lives. So what we could do is help the person make a list of important people in their life, and even people who they haven't seen in a long period of time. Sometimes just scrolling through your phone or media can give you this information. And then helping them reconnect with them has a remarkable effect on their mood. So this is something which we can use for ourselves. And I'm sure many of us are indeed doing that. And then there's the issue of routines. When we talk about routines, there are some really big myths to be busted. Routine is not something which happens automatically. You might decide to follow a routine, but the motivation from the routine for following the routine actually comes from outside. So the first and foremost thing that we want to advise people is not to really blame themselves for not following a routine. In fact, it's good that you've taken the decision to follow a routine. Now rely on motivators outside of yourself. Simple things like changing your clothes in the morning helps you get into a different mindset of a routine. Making appointments with people is yet another routine. I often tell people when I'm doing my consultation that actually they are helping me keep my routine. So people can help each other to keep their routines. So plant your motivators and drivers outside of yourself rather than relying on just the internal feeling of getting things done. So why routines? A lot of research on our biological rhythm shows that having routines actually help us have a sensible and healthy 24-hour cycle. Well, it also gets things done. And now that we have very few external cues, so if people are not working from their offices right now, that's what many of us are doing, or the usual travel and other cues which provide us with routine are not happening, we need to create external signals for our own routines. So I've given you some examples how to do that, and include people and external cues as much as you can in following your routines. Now, personal health has been on top of people's minds. So, as health services are shut down, how do we manage our personal health? The most interesting thing I've noticed as being a healthcare provider, that even though health services have been shut down in terms of face-to-face contacts, actually the access of healthcare to healthcare will paradoxically increase. You now have specialists visiting you by video or phone. This we couldn't have imagined just a few weeks ago within the healthcare community, which tends to be very conservative. Actually, connecting with clients through video or phone is not a largely or widely held notion. Now, perhaps companies like Snapclarity have been providing that for a period of time, but that is certainly not routine. But now we have this availability growing rapidly across the world. So there are various reasons to think carefully about personal health. In day-to-day life, we take our health for granted, especially our basic health care. But right now, we have to think about it more carefully. Consider your dental health, for example. Dentists are closed in many parts of the world. And actually, I'm paying more attention to flossing my teeth now than I ever did before. And all this actually makes healthcare interesting because now we have to have a checklist of various things, almost like your car maintenance. So personal health is also about getting organized. So I've had situations where people are running out of prescriptions, or they might have had a health plan which they have not been following for some time. So this is a good time to get your personal health plans on track. And there are lots and lots of advice lines in many countries where you can call people who can give you health advice. And these services have been available for a period of time now. Health anxiety is another big issue that we are seeing in these times. So we are having presentations in emergency rooms where people are really anxious that they might have contracted COVID-19. And we are in a difficult situation because wide testing is not available everywhere. So the way we approach this is to help people find the right health information from trusted sites. So for instance, what are the actual risks of contracting COVID? There may be a case that people are vastly overestimating the risk, even though it's an illness with higher rate of severity than normal flu. The actual risks may not be as high to an individual. The reason why we are taking these precautions is so we prevent the spread of virus to people who are more vulnerable. So news is important, and how many times have we found that we keep checking what's happening in the world with respect to COVID? And this activity can itself become very unregulated and start interrupting our routines. So one way to think about this is to have a strategy. So what's the content that we want? Of course, being informed is important. So where are the sites where we can get this kind of information? How often do we need to check the news? In our day-to-day lives, things are not going to change radically in few hours. So perhaps setting ourselves with some sensible sort of frequency, maybe 2 or 3 times a day to check news rather than scrolling and scanning the internet for hours or repeatedly throughout the day. And the news obviously has to be based on science. So there's lots and lots of news, especially in some of the social media sites, which may just not be accurate. And as a group, if you're living with people who are close to you, it would be important to check how we are all accessing this news and what's the quality of the news that we are accessing. Fun is important. And here I take the point that fun actually provides positive emotions. And again, that's a talk in itself, that positive emotions are actually good for our health. It's been linked to longevity. And when we are under the influence of a positive emotion, like happiness, of course, we tend to be more creative in our solution finding. we tend to relate better to people when we are feeling positive. So this is why fun is really important. And we are finding people being very creative in finding outlets for fun, connecting to the social media, or singing together across balconies. So there may be so many different ways to include fun and positive emotions in our life. Relationships have actually taken a new turn now. Even when we relate to people who are close to us, we are spending a lot more time now with people around us. In general, humans are social animals. And the reason for this is physically, we are far weaker than many of the hunting animals that have come before us in evolution. But we have been really successful in surviving because we do things together. And there are positive benefits of relating to people. When we are treating people with depression, one of our key approaches is to reconnect them with people who are close to them, and even people who they just know as acquaintances. And the rewards they get from this connection are very, very visibly effective in improving their mood. So how do we go around doing this? Now we have to actually be more deliberate about this. So there's FaceTime and there's also space time. So it's actually been my recent practice that I commonly check with my clients about the space they live in and how many people there are. Is their house all in one floor, or there are different floors, and how do they find time to be together and time to be alone? So these things are some important consideration in planning our day, because we are very much homebound now. The science of sleep tells us a lot how to manage our sleep, and this will also be another presentation. Our sleep drive is actually regulated by two major forces. So there's the 24-hour force. So in a 24-hour cycle, uh, uh, we have sleep and wake cycles. Uh, so, for instance, uh, over the 24 hours, around, say, evening time, we automatically start feeling sleepy. So, that's a normal 24-hour cycle. The second cycle is sleep deprivation cycle. So, in the span of the day, we are not getting sleep, so we're getting progressively sleep deprived. So, towards the end of the day, we feel the need for sleep. So, these are two independent cycles, and putting them on in the same direction is really important. So, for instance, if we do not have sleep routine, that affects the 24-hour cycles. If we nap during the day, that affects the sleep deprivation drive. So putting both the drives in the same direction is really important. And this is something which is becoming even more important to educate people. We also need to harmonize our sleep cycles. So you can imagine in the same household, if people have different sleep cycles, that could actually cause a lot of interruptions. So we need to work as a team to manage our sleep cycles together. Exercise is one of the single most important intervention in general in healthcare, but also improves the quality of sleep. We are going to invite a parenting expert to give us more advice on parenting. But it's kind of in the last few years, we haven't been in a situation where parenting is more important across the world, because no matter what the crisis is in front of us, our children will continue to develop. And it's also important for the parents' health. The education system is also trying to find out best ways to deliver the goods that they were designed to deliver. So, how do we manage parenting when there's social distancing and all the other constraints that we have with the coronavirus epidemic? So, first and foremost, if we can think of parenting in different segments, so we have very young children, we have preteens, teens, and then we have older children. Each of these children, each of these groups have their own needs, and we need to find a way to give them good rationales as to what's going on. In fact, one of the things which has been crossing my mind that perhaps the school system should have presentations for children at each level to inform them what we are facing collectively, what's the definition of an epidemic, how it affects people. It would be a wonderful education in science and society. As parents, we all have to take breaks too, because working from home, living so closely together can put a lot of stress and strain. And if you're the leader of the ship, you need to have some time for yourself too. A lot of parenting requires negotiation and compromise. And many families are already finding time to have family meetings on regular periods of time to decide on how they can work together in this situation, which at the moment doesn't seem to have a defined endpoint. There are many different things to cover in the area of lifestyle, but it is significant for us now because we might have taken lifestyles for granted, but now with the constraints that we have to find ways to continue this. One is that lifestyle tries with routine. Lifestyle is actually a very important regulator of health and relationships because it brings people together. So, how do we actually practice lifestyle? These are some uh, few pointers, and people may just have more. So, exercise is an important part of a healthy lifestyle that we know. Uh, but how do we work this out so that we are able as to do this as a group, say in a family? That would be an important decision to make in terms of lifestyle. Exercise independently actually has been shown to lower depression and anxiety, and in fact, in Canadian and in many other guidelines, exercise is included as one of the treatment of lower intensity of depression. So nutrition is not just about having a balanced diet now. Nutrition is also an activity that we participate in together with other people. When we talk about meditation, people think that somehow it's the kind of deep, thoughtless moment that we can arrive at through meditation, which is going to be very calming. My simple advice is that we don't have to become super meditators. So let's use meditation to suit the needs that we have now. So sometimes to break the cycle of worrying, and other times to just relax so that we are able to find some rest and peace. So there are many different styles of meditation, and this is not the presentation to cover today, and we hope to organize another presentation on this. We've covered a lot about social connections. So going into hobbies and interests, these things have taken a very creative term. We see people forming groups to practice hobbies. We see people taking up new hobbies which they had always wanted to take up before. So how do we tie these things up as a cohesive whole of lifestyle? Work is often seen as source of stress, but in fact, when we look at literature closely, working is better for mental health than not working. And there's huge agreement on this across research studies. Work is also important for financial consideration. It could be meaningful and enjoyable as well. So work has many, many positive qualities which need to be highlighted now. So how do we manage work now that the space where we live and where we work is actually coming together? On one hand, it has huge advantages. On the other hand, the separation of work-life balance could be a challenge. There may be also, and I'm very sensitive to the fact that there might be issues of people being unemployed or their work hours being reduced. We're lucky that in Canada, we have support from the government to help in these areas. We also notice now that people are doing more online courses to look at alternate careers. I've been helping people connect with employment agencies who have been a wonderful resource to help people manage finance, debt, look at career planning or job coaching. So these are some of the ways in which, even in our day-to-day life, we can start planning forward. Financial is stress is a huge stress going through the society, and in some ways the only way to deal with this is to become specific. So looking at the budget, taking stock regularly. There's never been a more important time, and I have to remind this to myself and people I work with, that we need to actually develop a discipline to plan times to look at finances on a regular basis. And there's lots of external advice. The banks are extending their help to give advice to people. There are financial websites, and there are agencies which might help people manage the finance better. And although it's kind of redundant to say, we are becoming more focused on what we need rather than what we want. So in conclusion, I'd like to make a very quick summary. And first of all, I apologize for the disruption with my battery failing. So I've tried to present three different angles today. The first was from logotherapy, which is Dr. Frankel's approach, that when we are faced with intense and almost unexplained suffering, it's still possible to find meaning. And the personal meaning derived through that suffering is the main driver to make changes in one's life. The second part I picked up from the area of problem-solving therapy, and that talks about how improving our faith in our ability to face our problems and solve them is the central key feature for success. So to meaning, we attach the self-confidence and self-faith in trying to face our problems. And within that field, we also looked at how to break problems down systematically and choose the most important ones to focus on. Finally, we also talked about how cognitive behavioral therapy looks at what goes on inside people's minds when they're getting stuck with problems. And going into specific areas, we delved into how people can deal with a range of problems which have arisen due to the rapid changes that we are facing. So we are hoping to organize more topics in the coming few weeks. So next week's conversation will be dealing with worry and anxiety, which is hugely fueled by uncertainty. And we look forward to have you in that conversation next week. Here's another list of topics just underneath that. We're hoping to cover sleep, eating, parenting, routines, habits, women's mental health, and several other topics, but we would really welcome your comments on what you would like to hear from us. So this is a time for question and answer, and I'm going to ask my colleague Bonnie to actually pick up on the questions and answers which have been coming through to us, and we'll try to handle them jointly. Thank you.
Everyone's being so quiet. Any questions from anyone? I'm going to ask a question, Dr. Rao. Can you explain the thought that it might be okay to find something hard to do? Is hard okay?
Is hard okay? Which part of the presentation struck you as finding something hard to do is okay or not?
Well, I think that you know what? This is unprecedented times. So what we're doing is foreign. So sometimes it feels hard. Does that mean that we won't succeed? Or is just hard a way that we can accept that it's hard, but I can still do it?
That's a good point, and that speaks to two things that, actually three things that we've discussed. One is, even if something is hard, if it's something which is meaningful to a person, then certainly it's worth the effort to begin with. Hard things can be broken down. So when we think of things as one whole, they look very big, but if we break them down, they can be more manageable. And the third thing is more from the cognitive behavioral therapy tradition, which is, when we say something is hard, what's the thought behind it? I mean, why is it that we are seeing that as hard? And within the same tradition, there's also the issue of modeling, that if we find something hard, there are other people who may have attempted those, and they can be like our role models to work on hard things. And finally, there is also a sense of achievement which comes out of working on hard things, which can be reinforcing itself.
Thank you. I'm just reading the comments. I'm hoping that people can hear me. If not, please send me another message, because my mic is on, but if it's not resolved itself. I'm looking at our questions here. There is a question here on helping, for employers, the thought on how best they could help their staff, or where to start with a staff approach.
So for employers, as in, okay, so obviously this is a question I'm going to try to answer the question from more mental health perspective, because there might be so many different ways on answering this question. So I think employers, and this is a good time where, in general, because there's a shared issue and a problem, so there is kind of no difference between the employer and the staff in that sense. Everybody is facing the same problem. I think the employers need to probably show sensitivity, and that's kind of still very abstract. What I mean specifically is, they might want to see how they can help their staff get through this as a crew, and then go down to being more specific. So what are the challenges? So for instance, there might be challenges which are special to single parents, for example. So how can the employers actually support people who have special needs or challenges? Are there ways in which they can give them good information about their healthcare needs? Can they set up systems to help people get advice and support for their mental health? And I know that some programs who are working with SNAP Clarity, they have this kind of system where they actually have a subscription, so they are available to provide coaching and guidance to people. So if employers have that sort of service where they are linked with programs which can provide mental health support, that would be ideal. There are EAP programs which can help people too. And if members have insurance or other benefits, they can actually be encouraged to use them. So these are some of the ways I'm thinking of in terms of the mental health perspective for the employers.
Thank you. This is another very relevant topic, is, someone that's struggling with addiction and having to self-isolate, and the challenge that they would be facing.
Yeah, this is very relevant. And I did have in mind whether I should include this as a topic or not. So I'm glad, because it's kind of a wide field in itself. Interestingly, certainly with the legalization of cannabis in Canada, there's actually sudden increase in demand. So people are using more now, that's for sure. and also very interestingly, it's actually the wine shops in Canada are open as essential services, I suppose. So how do people manage addictions? The one advice I have to say to people that the addiction services are not closed. They are still open. So when I'm dealing with my clients, I'm actually encouraging them, and I'm encouraging by telling them that, in fact, they might even be more flexible. You might be able to get your addiction group or counselor straight to the phone. So I'm encouraging them to actually get in touch with addiction services as early as possible, rather than focusing on trying on their own. So that would be my big advice, to not leave it too late. There are a number of other things to be done, but this would be the most important.
Perfect. A few more. This will reflect on our quick thought on sleep. But how do any thoughts on how people that work night shift?
It's a very good question. In fact, for people, I deal with this problem a lot, actually. If you have a certain condition like a mood disorder, like bipolar disorder, it becomes really hard because, in general, managing mood is linked with sleep cycles. So people who have night shifts, my advice would be to at least keep the shifts with the same regularity. If the shift hours keep changing, then the sleep times keep changing. So if you happen to be in a job which is night shifts, is there a way to negotiate regular hours within that shift? And I've sometimes worked with employers to help people find that regular hours based on health. So if you do have a specific health need, like a mood disorder, you can ask for support through your doctor to have regular shifts. But in general, for all of us, it's important to have a regular routine for sleep. So I would encourage that. Yeah. And if you are able to find something which would work in the daytime, that's ideal.
Okay. This is also something that a lot of people would be living, my mother included. So I think of her often. Advice for someone self-isolating that lives by themselves.
So this is an excellent situation. I think a lot of references I made was about families and people, but there are people who are alone. So my advice to people who are living alone is, number one, who were the people in their life, or who are the people in their life even though they are living alone? So if you remember that visual which showed cartoon of a person with figures with arrows around them. So my first advice would be to make a list or inventory. And actually, when I'm working with clients, and I've worked with a lot of clients who've been depressed and living alone, and pushing them to make that list for themselves makes a huge difference. And then being systematic in connecting with the people in that list. And sometimes we work together when we're doing cognitive behavior therapy, that we choose at least, say, 3 people to contact this week. Or how do we have a regularity of contact, either through phone, social media? There have been occasions where I've worked with people where just the contact with social media was a good starting point for them to get reconnected with people.
Thank you. We're still good for time, I think. Yeah, we've got a couple more minutes, and we won't stop if the questions keep coming. This is exactly what we're here for. So we're grateful to help. So please continue to ask. This is one from, and in our therapeutic world, it's the kind of that piece of any tips for people that are quite high achieving, or that type A personality that need to still continue to do everything really, really well with the limitations of the pandemic.
Okay. Type A personality. The reason I'm reflecting on it, because I'm reflecting mentally on how much the type A personality research has been replicated.
I know, and I knew that's a big question for you. Yes, because we always want to go to science. Yes.
Yeah. So how much is? But I take it that you're talking about people who like to be driven, achieve things. there's a term in Britain called courses for horses, which means that each do their own style. So in working with such people, in fact, there are some advantages in its own way for them. So if they have a need to achieve and do things well, they can shift that need to, how do I organize my life? How do I organize my routine? How do I organize my connections with people? How do I organize my home? People are taking things like sorting out the garage or their living room, or the cupboard. So there are many small achievement tasks which they can place around their life and work through that.
And then there's that responsibility piece of feeling like you need to take care of others. That could certainly play a part in someone worrying about something that they can't manage or control.
Yeah. So the responsibility piece is something which I feel has become very important. In fact, I'm noticing that people are not so self-centered, even in the midst of real crisis and depression and anxiety. I'm finding that people are showing more other-centeredness. And yes, for somebody who is very driven, they can take that as a project to help people in their own way from distance. That could be yet another way. But when you said about that, were we referring to in general, or were you referring?
A little bit of both. Yeah, just a quick touch point. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Although I've seen an interesting phenomena when I'm having sessions with clients. This is the first time in my entire career people ask me how I'm doing, and they end the session by asking me to look after myself, which is I feel very grateful for that. But I'm noticing that people have their own difficulties, but they are also looking out for other people.
Mm. Nice. Mm-hmm. Okay. I think we got to the questions, all the questions so far. And I encourage everyone to continue to send your questions, and I will continue to respond. You know what? And we're going to be doing this weekly. So we're here for you. It takes a community, and we're grateful to be able to do this for you. So as questions keep coming, write them down, and we're always going to be available to answer them if it's not right now. This is another one here.
Okay, yeah. We keep going as questions come.
Mm-hmm. I don't. Hello. Oh, somebody says hi from Halifax.
Well, hi to you folks in Halifax.
If we could bottle some Halifax air in a jar and distribute that, I think we'd all, it would all make us feel better. So, okay, no question, just hi. I'm going to pull a little bit. So for me, as you teach me through my learning of CBT, I really like the way you explain self-efficacy. So could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so when we look at literature and we look at long-term studies and studies across different fields like achievements-oriented fields like sports, music, education, career, the one factor which seems to cut across is self-efficacy, which is literally, if we just want to put it in language which we can all understand and identify, is faith in one's ability to take up life's challenges or the challenge they're faced with. It's not the actual ability, so it's not the actual ability or talent, but the belief in oneself. And that seems to be really important. Mm-hmm. There's more research into self-efficacy. One is to show that people who solve problems well, they seem to have a lot of self-efficacy. In my own practice, I've seen that when people are getting treatment for depression, even when the depression improves, if the self-efficacy doesn't improve, they have difficulty in getting back to life. So a lot of the emphasis could be not just being undepressed, but being able to face the challenges of one's life. there's even more interesting research on self-efficacy, that there may be something very general about it, but there may be something very specific about it. So we may not have the same kind of self-efficacy beliefs in all areas. So we may be better in some areas and less so in other areas, because we can't have strong self-belief in everything, in every ability. So there's work-related self-efficacy, for example, as a specific thing to. We've been having these questions about how do we manage work, and in terms of work and mental health. So yeah, so there's the general self-efficacy, and there are specific types of self-efficacy applying to different areas in life.
Okay. I don't have any other questions currently. A lot of people thanking us, which is, we thank you. It's our privilege to do this for you.
Yeah, we thank you. And I think this was our first setup, and we are all working remotely. So getting it to pull together, I'm incredibly grateful to the Snap Clarity team who worked over Easter weekend to make this happen. And hopefully next time we'll have less technical glitches from my end.
You were covered very well.
Thank you.
Okay, well, if there's no more questions, I guess we could not say goodbye, but see you later. And hopefully, yes, we'll see you same time, same place next Tuesday, 7 to 8. And we'll talk a little bit more about worrying. And I think I'm going to leave it with worrying. What I've learned to do is I see worrying like a task. So I clean my house, I go to work, I worry, but I then know that my work day ends. I can stop cleaning when I feel like it. So I'm like, I identify I'm worrying. I don't want to worry. What can I do to not worry? So I process it just as simple as a task of, I just don't feel like doing this anymore.
Yeah. So Bonnie, hold that thought. More conversation on that next week.
Take it up next week. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and well.
Stay safe, folks. Good evening.